Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. Speaking of complete streets, I feel like I've been talking nonstop for the last 2 days. So if I just decide to sit here silently and look at you all for a few minutes, you'll know what's up. Yesterday we released well, first I'll say a little bit more about Transportation for America. How many of you are familiar with Transportation for America? Well, that is excellent. That's probably 3/4 of you or so. So just for those of you who didn't raise your hand, we are the largest and most diverse coalition that's been assembled yet to work on trying to influence national transportation policy. As most of you know, Congress reauthorizes a bill every 6 years or so, has since the 1950s, that governs our national transportation policy. But usually it's an exercise in dividing the spoils, and industry groups are involved. Not very many ordinary Americans know what's happening or are involved. And so our purpose here as Transportation for America is to try to involve a whole lot of different constituencies. I'm taking a slightly different tack here. Usually I'm the guy who's trying to think about how to talk to ordinary people and how to appeal to their individual interests and explain this set of issues to people. But I think that we are at a time of immense change. That we are in a sort of a phase shift mode where things could change very rapidly. I want to kind of retrace our steps a little bit historically and show why I think that there is going to be enormous change coming in the transportation world, whether or not many of us are good at talking about it. So let me see if I can figure out how to work this. Let's see. Which button is supposed to? See, I'm not. Yeah, that's what I thought I did. Okay. So we're coming out of what you might call the era of suburbanization, the big suburbanization project that this country engaged on. And it happened for a lot of really good reasons. Many of us who have been complaining about sprawl and what it's done to us, to our landscape, fail to remember what it was like in cities after an era of rapid industrialization, going through a Great Depression, a couple of world wars, and after World War II, when we had to live through things like this, when we were reminded that when we rode alone, we ride with Hitler, and having to go through the privations, and coming out the victors on the other side. And we had to do something with this incredible industrial might that we'd built, and this relieve the pressure that had come to be in our cities with so many people living together and on top of each other, sometimes literally. So we turned this great machine to the project of suburbanization, and it was marketed right out of Detroit here by General Motors, urging people to give a man some room to roam in. And we hearken back, and I think you may hear a little bit more about this in just a minute, but talk about moving minds. Here was a project that GM sponsored in the 1939 World's Fair, the Futurama, that millions of Americans lined up to see, to get a vision of what could be different from what we're dealing with now. And what they did was sit in these chairs and go around this display that showed the Corbusier kind of towers in the park with freeways going around, and nobody ever actually stopped. It was beautiful. So building on this vision, on this idea of the Autobahn, and of this great highway network that people were familiar with from this World's Fair experience, Eisenhower proposed a great interstate highway system that would network the country and would result in a 40,000 mile system. And we would do it with 90% federal funding, get the states to contribute 10%, and we would do it in record time. And this is kind of the landscape that resulted out of this big suburbanization project. People used the freeways to move out farther and farther. We carved the land up into these kinds of subdivisions. And if you notice, we did something bizarre for people who were ostensibly designing a landscape for the car. We actually terminated most of the roads so that they didn't connect with each other and forced people to get out onto these busy arterial roads, which was a large part of the subject of the study that I was going to tell you about that we released yesterday, called Dangerous by Design. And part of what we were doing with Dangerous by Design was in some sense reframing the issue of investing in bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure, for one thing, as a frill. John McCain and Tom Coburn in Congress recently attacked spending on bicycle and pedestrian safety projects, saying these were frills. They were worse than worse than frills, they were a total waste of money because they didn't move cars. Well, our purpose was to do a pedestrian danger index, compare region to region around the country for how dangerous they are. And what you find is that the most dangerous places are the places that have the most miles of this stuff, of the arterial roads that make no provision for people on foot. This is just a basic idea that streets are not complete if they don't provide this. So here we are at this incredible moment of change with the suburbanization project really coming to a screeching halt. And this Tom Tolles, as he so often does, his cartoon sums it up brilliantly. The first frame is, my house is too big to heat and it's too far from work, that I drive to in a car that's too large, fueled by gas that's too expensive, and the money just goes to terrorists who want to attack the way I live, and I'm too tired for irony. And we did a poll last year and did it again more recently. And of course, the economy question now is paramount. But even still, our worries about dependency on oil, and interestingly, we already saw this slide. I'm kind of irritated with you for preempting me here. But interestingly, the question was not asked about, are you worried about dependency on foreign oil? It was oil. And you don't have to say foreign. People understand we are in a different place with energy. They really do get it. They understand it in their pocketbooks as well as they understand it intellectually. And we've seen a surge arise in transit ridership. I agree with my previous speaker that too many buses ride around without enough riders in them. But many of them became very crowded recently when gas prices went high. And then actually, as the economy has been down, people continue to try to save money by using the public transportation system. And what we've been over our policies since the 1950s has been to try to service a growing vehicle miles of travel, service what seemed to be the inexorable rise in people driving more, women entering the workforce, driving greater distances because we're moving farther out in the countryside, commuting longer for work. But actually, this trend is continuing, and it's discouraging that it's continuing. But it actually has leveled off recently, and one can imagine that it could continue to level off, particularly if we do anything to address the global climate change and address the energy issues. And we think that something is going to happen, and it is likely to affect energy prices, likely to affect our fuel consumption. And it really has to happen, because if you look at this chart, of the emissions that are attributable to transportation, the United States has an outsized share, about 5% of the world's population and 45% of car-related greenhouse gas emissions. And why do we drive so much? It's not hard to figure out. You can't get out of any of these cul-de-sac subdivisions without looping around, getting out onto the arterial road that takes you to the freeway. Every single thing you do is divided